Great, thanks, Nicole. A very heartfelt thank you to for suggesting that we do this. Looking forward to having a chat with you all. And I think between my role here in CCAMLR and being such a local village of Hobart, that you all probably know what CCAMLR is. Maybe most of you might know a bit more about how CCAMLR works or how it doesn't work. And few of you probably know what the current topics are that are being discussed in CCAMLR over the past year or two, especially. But Nicole's right, we're just wrapping up now to our big meetings. The first science group meetings start on the 28th of September, so all the papers are pouring in now, and there's a lot of really, there's a nice buzz around it this year. Issues and potential to have some really good progress made at the meetings this year. So what I plan to do today is to give you a bit of overview of CCAMLR, but really focus in about how we've been working for the past few decades, really, and what we're trying to accomplish, and also what the current challenges are, current issues that we're facing, and how the Commission and the Scientific Committee is dealing with that. Got two separate screens here that are working independently. Okay, so this is the overview. I'll talk about what CCAMLR is and what it does. We'll go through a bit about how we monitor fisheries and how to manage them, what we're doing for ecosystem monitoring and how we manage that, and the key management issues and science needs we'll have going forward. So first of all, the convention area, you probably all know this, but it's pretty large, almost 10% of the world's oceans. Unique to CCAMLR is that the technical definition of the boundary is an ecological one. It's based on the Antarctic convergence. And then we have to square it off a bit mostly for compliance reasons, but from a science perspective, we try to include everything south of the convergence. And CCAMLR's mandate is to manage all living resources in the Southern Ocean, and with some exception around the management of exploitation of whales and seals. Those are done by other groups, but CCAMLR does include whales and seals in the entire ecosystem in its considerations of the effects of fishing and how it manages the ecosystem as a whole. There are 27 members currently. We get a new member every couple of years or so. There's 10 big states and some non-contracting parties and about 20 different observer organizations that come to the meetings each year. There's a full list of countries there on the right. You can see if your home country's there. The Commission is supported by a secretariat, which is where I work. It's just up here on Macquarie Street. We'll be putting the flags up in a few weeks, 2 weeks. Within the Secretariat, there's 5 different divisions. I'm the manager of the Science Division, but there's a Finance and Administration component. We have in-house translation into the 4 CCAMLR languages. So all of our documents and paperwork is done in those languages, and there's a whole communications team. If you think of the Secretariat really as the filing system for everything that the Commission ever does. And you need a lot of people to actually put all of those things together in a place where you can find them again. There's also a big monitoring and compliance division there. So all the vessels have vessel monitoring systems, and we track where they are and the catch limits and when things are open and closed by areas. So there's a team that works on that. And then we hold a lot of data that all the members collect, fisheries data, ecosystem data, all the monitoring and compliance data, VMS data. And so there's a whole team of people that manage those databases and critically work with members and the public for access to that information, because you wouldn't want to be just turned loose in there. It's quite a complex data environment. So if you're interested in any of those particular places or departments, then welcome to wander up, make an appointment, and we can show you a bit more about what we do there. So the convention, from a science perspective, is the key article is Article 2. And that's where the objective of the convention is laid out, along with the criteria, the scientific criteria used to evaluate whether or not you're meeting the objective of the convention. And the second part of Article 2 there, those A, B, and C paragraphs, really define the three things that CCAMLR is trying to do scientifically. One is, of course, you can have fishing, exploitation is allowed. That's what this rational use idea is about. But it has to meet the conservation needs of not interfering with stable recruitment, maintaining the ecological relationships of all the pieces of the system. And if you do change something, you have to have some sort of idea that if you stop doing what you're doing, the system will return to what it was previously over 2 or 3 decades. That last bit is a very interesting one going forward when we start thinking about climate change and whether things can return to what they were 20, 30 years ago. I think that will be one of the interesting things for the Commission to deal with in the future. Up till now, that has been some fairly basic modeling around influences on target stocks. So CCAMLR implemented this mandate for ecosystem approach to fisheries management back in 1982, when sort of before it was cool. Now you see it in a lot of the languages of the RFMOs around the world. But over the past few decades, CCAMLR has really taken that concept and worked it into its management procedures. And so we have a very good way to both deal with the target stocks using an ecosystem approach, and also ways to include potential effects on the ecosystem and monitor for it. And they've been doing that since day one. Actually, from a data collection perspective, CCAMLR is in a really good place because we've been collecting high resolution data on bycatch, for example, bycatch species since the 80s. So we have a lot more information to draw on compared to local places. The Commission, through the convention, has a number of powers to do things. Article 9 is where the methods that are at the disposal are listed. So this tells you basically you can open and close things, set catch limits, set the regulations around who's allowed to go where and when. And this is what the main list the Commission uses in implementing those management objectives. We're pretty lucky in that we only have 3 types of fisheries. There's krill, toothfish, and icefish. I'll talk mostly about krill and toothfish here. There's only 2 small icefish fisheries, and both of those are within EEZs and also haven't really been exploited very much in the past 5 or 6 years. So that makes it very nice for us to have 30 different species to manage, and it also allows CCAMLR to focus on just the biology of those particular species directly. The way science is integrated into policymaking within CCAMLR starts with all the data that are collected. These come from vessels and observers and ecosystem monitoring. We hold most of that information, and the Secretariat does a lot of analysis and work to summarize that information for the working groups and the scientific committee. Members also take access to that information to conduct their own analyses. And all of the science work is vetted through science working groups. Currently, CCAMLR has 5 working groups. You see them listed there. I won't go through the details of each one, but they range from the methodologies, statistical methodologies around the modeling, how to actually estimate biomass for target stocks and bycatch species, through ecosystem considerations to the ecosystem monitoring and management working group. These all come in a bit of a sequence as well. So that advice tends to go to the fish stock assessment working group, which looks at the final stock assessments and developing catch limits for the species each year, but also integrating all of the other requests from the other working groups for new types of data to be collected or potential changes to rules to make the stock assessment easier, that kind of thing. And there's also a working group that occurs this time of year around incidental mortality associated with fishing. That is different conceptually within CCAMLR from bycatch. So bycatches are species that you know you're going to catch when you're out fishing. Sort of accidental, it's not non-target catch. Whereas incidental mortality is really around seabirds and marine mammal interactions. So these are things that it's not that you know you're going to catch a few while you're out there, and so you just minimize it. These are we're trying to get to zero. And that's the main conceptual difference, and why there's a whole working group just on trying to minimize those interactions. And to be fair, CCAMLR had a big issue in the past with seabird mortality on both the longline and on trawl vessels, and they did an amazing job over 20 years ago in reducing the incident interactions with seabirds down to double digits now. I think last year we had 12. Pretty impressive reduction from I think we were at 70 to 80,000 birds when we started. So very dramatic decrease there. Anyway, all those things happened up until the first week of October, pretty much. And then we have the scientific committee. So at the level of the scientific committee, we bring in observer organizations. So that's that little arrow on the bottom. Prior to that, everything is all just members and member expert groups discussing things. The scientific committee develops its advice to the commission, and then that's added to advice from the compliance folks, which is implementation and compliance committee, and the administration and finance group, and that all goes to the commission and they make the final decisions. So that's an annual cycle that we go through every year, and we're just at the wherever that little side arrow comes in now, and in the end of winter. So the science working groups are pretty informal. Everybody's there as scientists. There's no flags on the tables. Just discussions around, they can still be heated discussions, but around particular scientific aspects and providing advice to the scientific committee and what to do. Because when you get to the scientific committee, then there's flags on the tables, and what the purpose of this is to do is to have all the members, and now you've got the flags, to agree on that best scientific advice that's going forward to the commission. This meeting is the scientific committee meeting, is very fast paced. There's a lot of issues to get through. It's only lasts, it's really only about a 3.5-day meeting because you have to generate reports and all that. So we really tick through the advice, and you have to have nice, clean advice coming from the working groups. That's why the working groups can take weeks and weeks to discuss things. Scientific committee, a big topic that you just spent a week on, will be done in 20 minutes. The commission then, in implementing its actions, does most of that through conservation. And this is sort of the standard outline of the conservation method. It gives you all the details of where it applies, who it applies to. There's all sorts of exceptions here and there. It sets catch limits, when seasons are open and closed, if observers are required. All that detail is done in the conservation measure for a particular area, and then there's a whole raft of conservation measures that are around reporting requirements and details of how often you have to report, what you report. So this creates a book, and now it's around 300 pages long. That's agreed every year, and that is essentially the law of working on the Southern Ocean each year. All the members treat it as law, and that's what that compliance committee does. Is they go back and every year and look at any infraction on those rules and have this little international court about what they're going to do about it. So all the decisions that go into these conservation measures are really wordsmith. It's well past the science. We're just in a room with mostly lawyers sitting there talking about how to do something. And that is treated as rule of law. It's also all done by consensus. So any time one of these is open for discussion, it's not closed again until everybody agrees on what the close looks like. So they've had a few instances in the recent past where they couldn't agree on a conservation measure, it doesn't go forward, and it causes all sorts of problems. But that's one of the bad things, or the good things about decisions by consensus is once everybody's agreed, everybody's agreed. So I'll go into a couple, I'll talk about krill and then toothfish a little bit, so, and how we manage them. So first, Antarctic krill. So it's recognized Antarctic krill is a key ecosystems species. Everywhere, everybody eats them. The fishery is based on pelagic trawling. And I'll talk about the catch limits in a couple of slides coming up. The big issue here is spatial overlap with other krill predators between them and the fishery. And interestingly, the reason people fish for krill or have up until now, it's mostly been meal and whale oil for aquaculture. And that market is growing. It goes into pet food. There's a couple of countries that use it just for human consumption. Norway is really focused on nutraceuticals, so a lot of it goes into the krill oil tablets that you can buy, and everybody's skin looks wonderful. So that's the growth areas for krill has been nutraceuticals and an increase in the demand for aquaculture products. That with a backdrop of krill, getting good quality krill processed on board is really technologically challenging. And they've been working for the past 15 years or so on that methodology, and they're finally getting it. And so now all of a sudden it's opening more market doors, and that's why you see an increase in the amount of krill caught every year because they finally can sell it for a bit more. So it's still not, they don't make a lot of money, but it's getting to the point where they could. So the catch history, you can see there's a big drop in the early 90s. That was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then since then, it sort of bumped along around 150,000 tons. For the past 20 years or so, it's been mostly in the 300,000 ton range. This has always been with a, well, for most of this time series, the catch limit has been, I think of it as around 620,000. So they haven't been taking anything near the catch limit. It's been increasing every year. And for the past few years, it's been well over 400,000. I think the last numbers I saw as of last week, they might be at 480 this year, and it might even break 500. So there's definitely more interest. It's the same number of vessels. They're becoming more efficient with it. The technology for continuous trawling is still growing, and new vessels are switching over to that technology. One of the other things to point out on this slide is that green line that sort of goes downward to the right is showing the number of areas, number of spatial cells that had fishing in them through time. And that's just within sub-area 48.1, which is the Antarctic Peninsula. So that the amount of area that they're fishing is going down each year. So they're getting more and more catch out of smaller and smaller areas. That's one of the problems that they're trying to solve with this sort of new approach I'll talk about. You can see in the two maps on the right, back 20, 30 years ago, krill fishing was dispersed all around Antarctica. And now it's really just at the tip of the Antarctic Peninsula. There's still large catch limits here of East Antarctica. Nobody's really fishing for them, and everyone's, I think China went 2 or 3 years ago, and they just dabbled a little bit, much. There there hasn't been a lot of interest with vessels to even notify going there. So the game right now is really at the tip of the peninsula, and it's got mostly to do with operational constraints and what the vessels can do. But that could change, that could be solved with technology. You could see people trying to fish here, especially if there's limitations in the market value goes up. So we'll see where that goes in the future. So in setting catch limits, especially in implementing CCAMLR decision rules, you actually need a significant amount of information. That information is around the population structure. Krill are really hard to age, so it can't. So we use length proxies for a lot of the age selectivity or age structure of the population. Something of an abundance index, although that's not really important with krill, the way that the modelings work. And you need to know about age of maturity. And then you need information about the removals from the system, which would be fishing and natural mortality, and additions to the system, such as growth of the individuals, getting bigger and weighing more, and recruitment variability from year to year. All that goes into a projection model that applies the CCAMLR decision rules to estimate the catch limit. So I mentioned earlier that CCAMLR took its mandate for an ecosystem approach and embedded it in its management procedures. And this is one of the examples, is in these decision rules. Like these were developed here by lead authors from local. And for krill, the way it works is just to set up these 3 rules. The first is you model the population to get a distribution of what you think the size of the population was in biomass, or is in biomass. It's an unfished population. And that gives you a distribution, so there's some variability in what your estimate of that biomass would be. And then you do some projection modeling of the population based on its biology, and you calculate a catch of a removal that, given all of those assumptions in the model, would result in the population biomass falling below 20% of its original biomass at 10% of the time. Okay, so that's that second line, and that creates that middle graphic, so that you push that population down to where you've got a 10% chance of falling below 20% of the original biomass. That's called the depletion rule. The third part is then you calculate again the constant catch over the long term that in 20 years would drive the population to 75% of its unfished biomass. It's usually a 50% probability of achieving that, and that gives you another catch limit. And then you just choose the lower of the 2. So the way it works is the uncertainty that you have in the modeling parameters, so the uncertainty that you have in the original population size, and the uncertainty that you have in recruitment variability from year to year tend to push the catch lower for that depletion rule. You end up pushing it below 20% more often if you're uncertain. And the 75% rule is to recognize the ecosystem role of krill and set a target where you would depress the population by only 25%, compared to most fisheries where you would be targeting like MSY or something for krill. I don't know what it is. Probably, I guess it's in the low 20%. So that 75% value is based on some modeling, but it's also based on a negotiation of, you're going to have some, but 50%, which is what they ended up with. The toothfish is the top predator. They just went halfway between that and 100% to get 75%, and then did some modeling to see how much, what that would look like. So that's the decision rule that they use for projection modeling for krill, and I'll show you how that's used in a bit. So the catch limits, when you look at that type of modeling for area 48.1 now, we have a biomass estimate in 48.1. There are 3 biomass estimates in 48.1 now, each one 20 years apart. about 60 million metric tons in that one sub-area. So the precautionary catch limit of that model is 5.61 million tons. And everybody looked at that, their eyebrows went up a little bit and said, well, that's actually a lot of catch. We have no way to catch that amount. Let's be precautionary here and until we understand a bit more about how the system would respond to that and how the fishery would respond to that. Let's keep the catch a bit lower. So although the catch limit, you'll see where it's called the precautionary catch limit, is 5.6 million. They set something called a trigger level, and they set that at 620,000. So from the catch limit being about 9% of the 60 million, they put the trigger level at less than, well, it's over 1% of the trigger level. That 620,000 tons is then spread across the different sub-areas of Area 48. So South Georgia and South Orkneys and the Antarctic Peninsula, and the South Sandwich Islands as well, we'll get a split of that catch limit. And that's where you end up with the Antarctic Peninsula catch limit is 155,000 tons is the trigger level for that. It's the lowest one of all of them. And the way the conservation measure was written is that we won't go above the 620,000 until there's some way to distribute the catch in space and time to deal with the overlapping predators. And it sat there for 15 years now. They've never really been taking the catch limit. It's always been around 300 or 350 or so. So there's been no pressure on that 620,000, but we're getting there now. It's almost impossible to catch 620,000 logistically because of how it's split up and getting everything exact. You really probably couldn't do it. And it's also influenced by sea ice distributions and where vessels can go. So I don't think that they would be able to get much more over 500, 550, something like that would be the absolute top end, unless they get very creative. But what's in play right now is a proposal, which is that final bar on the right, which is a proposal to more than double the catch limit in Area 48.1 by itself, but to split it into 9 different smaller management units. So that you spread the catch throughout that area. I'll show you a bit more about what that looks like. That would only apply in sub-area 48.1, but the idea was that you'd then be able to cookie cutter that approach to the other sub-areas. So in a nutshell, the problem with krill is that we have a precautionary catch limit. Nobody argues about the 620,000 or even numbers of up on over 1 million or so. That's well within sustainability for the population from what we understand. But the fishery is a big predator and it's competing with the other predators and they're all trying to find where the highest concentrations of krill are and you end up with pictures like this. And that is the holy grail, is to try to find a way to separate the fishery from where the predators are. There are krill sort of everywhere, but they both want the highest densities of krill. And so that's what this new management approach is attempting to do, is to figure out ways to objectively separate the fishery from the predators. So this revised krill fishery management approach, you'll see written up in our reports over the past 2 to 3 years. I think it's been around for almost 9 years now. It's got 3 components to it so far. First is that you need a good survey information about the biomass in the area. So that's what the B0 is on the top. And the way they will do that is actually get fishing vessels to incorporate acoustic surveys as part of their requirements for being on the water. So that's actually been written up, agreed last year. This year, we'll be looking at the protocols, and that could actually go on the water next year as full coordinated annual. Actually, the design is to survey all of Area 48 within, Area 48.1 every 2 or 3 years. So that you have biomass estimates. The second is that you continue to work with those projection models, as I described, to calculate a gamma, which is the percentage of the biomass that you're allowed to catch. Those two things give you a precautionary catch limit. And then the third is this terminology we're using is spatial overlap analysis. It's a spatial allocation to take the catch and spread it throughout space and seasonally as well. So we're calling this the harmonized approach because we had a workshop, a symposium actually, back in August, which was July, only 2 months ago, since it was years. And we developed this harmonized approach. And the idea behind this is that all those blue polygons are the management areas. So there are 9 management areas in subarea 48.1. The hashed and lightly shaded gray areas is a marine protected area proposal for the Antarctic Peninsula. Both of those have been around a while. A few years ago, actually 3 years ago, the scientific committee and the commission linked those two things together. So they said, look, there's good information out there that says you could increase the catch limit in 48.1, but no one's going to agree to an increased catch limit in 48.1 until you have better monitoring, collect better data, and have a marine protected area in that zone to protect the predators, even outside the closed areas. So those two things are linked now, and that's what the purpose of this workshop was to bring everybody together and negotiate a way that you could have an agreed MPA, increase the catch, and increase monitoring with this spatial spread. Out of that workshop, they came up with a single proposal for marine protected area. They also came up with sort of semi-agreed or potentially agreeable catch limits in 48.1 and an agreed scope for a data collection plan. And that's what's all coming to the scientific committee next month at this time. So it'll be a really interesting discussion. The main krill fishing companies and countries are very interested in having higher catch limits in these areas where, frankly, they get better protection to do transshipment. So it's operationally easier for them to work in 48.1. And the krill biomass estimates are high. They know where to go. They know how to fish there. So they're very interested in trying to make this work. And from the conservation side, those proponents are also very motivated to get this MPA proposal across the line. So it's in a great negotiation space. There's still a few wild cards in there, and there's still a lot of little details to work out on how you'd actually do it. But all the main pieces are there. They're all tractable. It'll come down to money, political will, and engagement in the system. Okay. Talk about toothfish for a little bit. The toothfish, you have 2 different species, and toothfish is really the polar opposite of krill. Right? It's a top predator. It's really deep water compared to krill being on the surface. The annual catch is really small. That 16,000 tons is the global convention area annual catch for toothfish. That's about equivalent to the Australia-only blue grenadier quota. Okay, so it's a very small deposit. It's a small fishery. It's also not something that's going into pet food. It's a luxury item. It's in restaurants that, I don't even know if you can buy toothfish in a restaurant in Hobart. Try, but it's usually in the $200 a plate kind of restaurants that I don't go to. So it's a luxury fish. So it's just very conceptually different animal. It's also much longer lived, and you catch them one at a time. So it creates a whole bunch of opportunities on how you can manage them differently than krill. Krill, we have no one's counting individual krill, and it's actually really difficult to figure out how much krill comes on board a vessel when we do these massive amounts at a time. Toothfish is much more straightforward in that sense. Toothfish fishing happens circumpolar. All those blue polygons show the areas where tooth fishing, they're not all active right now, but those are all where we have a history of toothfish fishing. The orange polygons are two assessed fisheries, the Ross Sea and Hemi, that are used to help manage these more data poor areas through different types of analogies and some modeling work. Within those polygons, the green areas are really the only places they can fish. Those are the particular bathymetric range where toothfish live, starting at 550 meters. So even though they live shallower than that, not too many of them there, and they've focused the fishery. It's prohibited to fish shallower than 550 meters. So it's actually a very small part, and the fishery research fishing is all spread out enough that you probably won't see a much more of an expansion in toothfish fishing circumpolar. There's not a lot of spaces to do it. So I think they'll be working on just ways to better manage and reduce the uncertainty in what managing the stocks that are there. Toothfish are unique in that they don't have a swim bladder. So, and being big fish in the way that they're caught on the long lines, they're in pretty good shape when they get to the surface. So they've been able to start tagging. They started off tagging them, industry started tagging them just to see where they go. It worked out well enough that we thought we could use a market capture program to actually estimate biomass using tagging. It's been done since 1997. It became mandatory in 2004. And now we've currently have more than 400,000 tags deployed throughout the convention area, almost 50,000 recaptures, and a tag and reward program. So there's a lot of information that comes in from the toothfish in all of those little polygons that you see around the continent. The data that you get from that is really useful because it's an ongoing tagging program. So this is a unique tagging program globally. I'm not aware of any that come close to it. With tuna, you hear a lot about tuna tagging or the big game fish tagging programs. Those are usually done from a chartered vessel by observers, specialist fish taggers, and they go out and they put 80 or 100,000 tags in the water, and then they go back and they let those tags get recovered for years, and they don't do anything until the next cruise. This is an ongoing tagging program where vessels continuously tag. They tag based on their catch, they tag based on where they are, and they tag based on the size of the fish that they're catching. They have to match the size distribution of the fish that they're catching with the size of the fish that they're releasing. So they can't just tag all the small ones, for example. That creates a continuous stream of tags going in the water and a continuous stream of tags coming back. And you get these sort of diagonal tables like this that give you constant multiple year ways to estimate the abundance. You can do it for individual size or age groups of fish as well. And all that goes into these integrated stock assessments to estimate stock status through time. So the CCAMLR decision rules are also applied to toothfish with two numbers that are different. One is that instead of 20 years, they use 35 years, which is one of the basis of toothfish life history. And second is the status of 50% as a target. And the same as the same depletion rule. And one point many people miss about this is that both of these decision rule applications is done every couple of years. You go back and you reevaluate. So it's not like you set a catch limit and that's it for 30 years. You go back every year and recalculate what that catch limit should be for 2 years. So you're constantly adapting how that population would respond. So the key management issues for the fisheries outside of population dynamics for the target species is looking at ecosystem impacts of fishing, and these can be direct, such as the incidental mortality type problems. It could be indirect, which is influencing the predators or the prey of your species, of the target species, and potential for cascading effects. So you take out the predator and that changes what the prey does, which changes what that predator does. And also the potential effects of climate change on the productivity or distribution patterns of the species. Again, on the right, it's just the tools that we have to manage those. I mentioned there's a lot of compliance tools within CCAMLR. The biggest one is the catch documentation scheme, which I encourage you to take a look at. It's been really a useful tool to reduce the amount of illegal fishing in the Southern Ocean. It's gone down to the point now where we don't even really estimate it anymore. We don't have enough observations or intelligence to suggest there is any. There's an observer program that all CCAMLR vessels are now have an observer on board, 100% coverage there. Toothfish boats have 2 observers. Krill vessels have at least 1. Many have up to 3 observers. And with this new krill management approach, we're likely to see more observers be regulated, demanded, required on the krill boats. And icefish trawling has 1 observer with its knees at fishery. The observers and the vessels both collect a lot of information. The vessels focus on catch and effort data, as I mentioned, acoustic data as well. And the observers are focusing on the species composition of what they actually caught, actual species identification, bycatch composition, and all these other types of sightings around interactions with protected species, or tagging or other ecosystem type information. So moving forward, we're looking at switching from the sort of target species focus, kind of got the nuts and bolts of the stock assessments understood. It's really now about ecosystem integration. So that's where this krill fishery management approach, integrating with the marine protected area, is headed. Integrating climate effects into tactical management. So we've got a good list of things that we can monitor to feed back into our stock assessments for target species. And we're also developing ways to start to index what we think are the important factors in the ecosystem and report that back to the commissions. Right now, there's not a very good mechanism to do that. This is all going to take new data types, new analyses, new ways to use the information. One of them that will be key is the CCAMLR Ecosystem Monitoring Program. It's been in place for more than 30 years, a long time series on a lot of different animals. And for example, penguins is one of them, but you can see we have multiple species, many sites, 32 different campsites now, and that bubble plot is just showing the number of surveys for the penguin species. Each row is a different parameter value of the data that we're holding for the past 40 years. So there's a lot of information there that members are starting to go back and mine with the idea to use it in ecosystem status reporting and for managing the krill fishery. You can see the CAMP monitoring sites are heavily concentrated around the peninsula. Mostly where bases are, but the CAMP program is under review right now to try and adapt it to be collecting information that's the best information for climate change and ecosystem monitoring, but also to inform krill management on the peninsula. The biggest job, it links back to that spatial overlap analysis. And the way that works is you want to calculate a spatial distribution of total krill demand. So it's how much will the natural system demand for krill consumption in a map format. And then you take that information and you use it to push the fishery to areas where there's not so much demand from the predators. And we've got some information to do that with already. It's historical information, but we need more updated information. And we also need it for new species. For example, there's this paper from 2007. It's the only one I'm aware of that's done the math, but that estimated that the total krill consumption demand by fish, so myctophids and cruciform fish combined, is more than all the krill consumption for whales, seals, penguins combined. And we know nothing really we know there's some ice fish there, but I couldn't show you a map of them. We know very little about the distribution and density of metophids. So that's a big growth area to try to get some key information into that modeling exercise. There are lots of other data types out there. We have a marine debris monitoring program that tracks data from things that are lost or found by CCAMLR vessels. That allows us to track lost long-line fishing gear in spatial and temporal ways so that we can work with the industry to reduce the amount of gear that's lost. And then there's spatial management, which is always a big topic here. We've got 9 different planning domains for spatial management around the continent. There are 2 current MPAs, but 4 proposals. And the one that's got the most traction right now is that one on the Antarctic Peninsula. There are other spatial management mechanisms within CCAMLR. There's a special areas for scientific study. This is aimed around protecting areas and identifying places where the ice shelf is collapsed, or there's a large area where all of a sudden there's open water and there's light exposed to the ecosystem now, and we want to create incentives in a way for people to go study that before people get in there and stop messing around too much. There's also BMEs. So CCAMLR has been, since 2009, has had rules on the books about minimizing impacts to vulnerable marine ecosystems. We've developed 23 different indicator groups to do that with, and currently there are 61 registered designated BMEs and 3 different risk areas where the fishery is triggered based on a threshold of catch, of bycatch, an area that we were concerned about, and so those are closed until further review. And sort of the last thing that is sort of a new topic is these ice fish nesting areas. So back in 2021, Germany found this ice fish nest area. Usually when you see ice fish nests, there's 1 or 2 at a time. You see them here or there, not a big deal. They said, oh, wow, there's actually quite a few of them here. We'll put down some side scan sonar and do a survey. And they did a survey there, and all those little buck marks in that side scan sonar image are individual fish nests. And in the area they surveyed, they estimated more than 60 million nests, the largest one ever found. And if you put a fish in each one of those and add up an adult fish in each one of those, that's higher biomass than we have for that species of ice fish anywhere on the continent. We didn't even know it existed. So right now they're talking about what the best way is to actually manage that and protect it. So there's a lot of work going on in that space. We're looking at ways to communicate effects of climate change. There's a lot there to unpack. Everybody, what's going on there with pretty good space for the target species, but how we deal with it within the ecosystem monitoring and response is still an open question. For the ecosystem monitoring and management, we know what to do for the effects of fishing. Now we need to do it. So that's basically a risk management approach, but there's lots of different patterns that you need to go and do homework on. Just mentioned the target species assessments. Those last few points are really about, we don't have very good rules set in program to deal with ecosystem effects, except on a case-by-case basis. You can always put something on the table and say, this is important, we need to protect it, but there's really not a lot up until you go all the way back to the mandate about what we should do. And you can't do very many things that are automatic, like we do with BMEs, for example. Trigger one just based on data, there's no evaluation. So what's protecting a lot of these ecosystem concerns right now is that consensus requirement. You won't get anything happening in any of these areas unless everybody agrees. And so that does work both ways. And it's one of the reasons why I think we're actually in a really good place to have a lot of these discussions now, because we're not trying to stop something that's imminently going to cause a lot of problems. And the key challenges for the future, this is my last slide, comes down to funding as usual. But we need consistent national program data to be able to populate all these management activities. And we know that these ecosystem effects will be very regionally, so it's going to be difficult to just learn something in one place and apply it somewhere else. We know that we're going to have to make decisions with very incomplete information. We won't even know how the system works very well, but we'll be forced to make decisions on what to do about it. And we need to communicate what's happening with what we do know to a really wide range of audience, from the commission down to the scientific levels with all different backgrounds. And all of these things will have a lot of uncertainty about them. So I think those, to me, are the big challenges that can apply back to all of those different ecosystem and fisheries management. So that's how CCAMLR works. See the clock. So
thanks so much, Steve. Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. We've got a few minutes for questions. So maybe if there's anyone online with questions, just put your hand up and I'll make you aware of it. Anyone in the room to start with? I'm just not surprised.
For the biomass projection models, do those just come from marine ecosystem models?
no, they use the biomass projection models for krill you're talking about. That's uses the general yield model that was developed by AED. So it's basically a straight, it takes the productivity parameters from whatever species you're talking about, some recruitment assumptions, and then just and an age structure, and projects that into the future. And you can then take catch out of it and recalculate and look at the population status as a across probability field. So it's just a projection simulation based on those data.
Is there any thought towards doing projections in like a more sophisticated mechanism framework?
Yes, I should have finished off with that. There are 3 integrated assessment models for krill that are in development right now with 3 different countries, and I think we'll still be a few years away from having something that you could start to base management advice on. A lot of it is just, we've got a lot of data, krill's pretty data rich, and trying to put it all together and figure out what you want to use for an index of recruitment size, or what you want to use for fishery selectivity. Those are all, they're all difficult questions to work through. And that's where the assessment, integrated assessment methodology is sitting now. But there are people that are working on it, some new people that are coming to the meetings this year. So I'm hopeful that actually it's progressed pretty quickly.
Any other questions in the room or online?
You mentioned at the end there, opportunities for the incorporation of, or thinking about climate change, and that that's a bit of a wide open slather. It's not known how to do it, but there's no reason there couldn't be consensus potentially. So I'm wondering what you see the opportunities in that space.
I mentioned that climate change effects on target stocks. That was pretty well hashed out over the past 4 or 5 years. Not what the effects are, but what to monitor and how it could affect an integrated stock assessment. So I think that is really just sort of limited by data, and we're watching and incorporate that as we go. Climate change effects on the ecosystem is much more what could potentially happen. And I think people are still looking for those relationships. Those are really different. They're always just correlations. They're hard to actually test in a mechanistic way, but understanding the mechanisms for climate change impacts on particular distributions of individual animals or entire ecosystems, I think is the open book, because there's a lot of work out there that shows how climate change can influence individual populations through a model, and you don't actually see the climate projection models showing a lot of change in the short term, like in the next 30, 40, 50 years around the continent. Like temperatures aren't predicted to go up that, to change that much over that period, and especially deeper water. And I'm not seeing things, for example, work on ocean acidification, because I think that is going to change probably faster than temperature will change, and that has potential to impact the ecosystems at depth, where a lot of the, for example, the toothfish and the bycatch species of the toothfish fishery are all living and interacting. So I think really focusing on what we could be impacting on that Antarctic system specifically, and then backing up from there and saying what are the mechanisms that are most likely to change from climate change impacts, and how can we monitor that and do something about where we can move a fishery south or north or something and avoid that potential impact. Does that make sense as far as tactically what you could do about it?
Yeah.
But we don't have this. I showed you the list of dials that the commission has to make change, and there's not a lot of them. So what if climate changes, and it's going to be regional, smaller scale spatial impacts, what can you do? So MPAs are building in climate refugia types of criteria into their objectives. What their target is needs to be really well spelled out, so that protecting areas are going to change fast, or we're protecting areas that are going to be the last things to change. And then once things change there, then what do you do? So I think looking at the ones we have tactical tools that we can address would get more traction than the broader scale questions where something could change, where we don't have to, we can't do anything with the dials we have.
Great, I think we're just about out of time. Thank you so much again for coming and giving us a talk, especially when you're so busy. So thank you so much for